we saw this week on November 15th in Mexico, coordinated marches through different cities. They were labeled a Generation Z Mexico protest against Mexican left-wing President Claudia Sheinbaum. She's Jewish and anti-Zionist. And the Movimiento Sombrero, the head movement. So the protests, they were called in the internet. There is an audio leaking here. I'm just going to mute Ileana. I don't know if you have to mute them on here. So there is an audio leaking.
Oh, okay. This one.
Maybe it was just for the time being, or yourself. I don't know.
Do you need to mute it?
Oh,
Do we need to mute it?
I think so. Yes. Now the audio is not leaking. So the protests, they were called on internet as in internet, and there was a massive use as AI, and they were branding and described themselves as citizen movement of young people, non-partisan, anti-politics, anti-corruption, anti-power abuse, the typical hybrid warfare recipe. And the Movimiento Sombrero, that marched along with the Generation Z, in turn, presents itself through the figure of the martyr Carlos Manzo. He was the mayor of Uruapan who was murdered, and he presented himself as this narco-trafficking sheriff who founded the hat movement, Sombrero movement. So it's very impressive, Ileana. I don't know if you have the pictures of the protests, but mainly the footage showed that the majority of protesters, they were not young people, they were middle-aged and up. But the good thing is that this farce fell apart pretty quickly. It was not a spontaneous uprising. It was not a genuine youth movement, but it was an operation carefully planned, financed, and amplified by Mexican political elites and by international elites, corporate and media actors, and party actors, oppositional party actors, nationally and internationally supported. So according to Infodemia unit in Mexico and subsequent investigations, it all began on the 3rd of October. We had Azteca Noticias. It's a media, part of the billionaire empire of Salinas, and they aired a report presenting global youth, Generation Z, protesting all over the world. And then they used an influencer called Carlos Bello, who had no political ground or any path in politics before, to present this idea of Generation Z protests around the globe. And all of a sudden, this guy, this influencer, he was in the
chat. Sorry, is it this guy, Carlos Centeno?
No, this is Carlos Bello. This is the guy who is reporting them. He's denouncing them. He's a political analyst. They're both Carlos. It doesn't help, is it? Yeah. So the thing is that Salinas, the owner of the media empire Aztecos, boosted Bello's speech in his own accounts. Yeah. So, of course, he was trying to manufacture a young face of an influencer, apolitical, against political abuse, to create a political narrative. And right after, Bello announced a march in his media networks. Once he gained a profile, he announced a march with no demands, no date. And this is it's a tactic of counterrevolutions. You have a diffuse protest against everything. Let's just march against the government. There's nothing particularly about it. So in October 15, right after, we have accounts of a so-called Generation Z, which was inactive for 1 year, posting a flag of one piece, a symbol of that has been recycled by youth-led protests, account countries, and they start to amplifying this. And it's very interesting because this account was used before to go against Venezuela, against Ecuador, and against Latin American left-wing countries. It was what it was found. And this page has foreign administrators, which is also very impressive. So what we can take from that is this is not a Mexican youth movement. It is an ecosystem articulated with international far-right networks, calling a march with no demands, just for Sheinbaum to step down, and without clearly stating what it was about. So and the slogan was "Let's save democracy," a very well-known statement that we know, but save democracy from what? So it's very interesting because they did an investigation and found out, along with Revista Fortuna, they describe how between October and mid-November, the operators pushed hundreds of TikTok accounts and more than 300 Facebook. So they just rented those Facebook accounts that previously talk about makeup, cooking, traveling. All of a sudden, they became a political account, and 50 of those TikTok accounts just appeared. They had administrations abroad, like in Spain, US, Bolivia. So it's very, and then the speech, which was originally "Let's march peacefully," changed. They began to circulate simultaneously AI generated images of the National Palace on fire and scenes of chaos and violence. So it's pretty obvious what's going on here. But what I want to tell you is that the financing behind this. First of all, you have Ricardo Salinas, the billionaire of TV Azteca. He was supporting it. He was creating the digital ecosystem, amplifying the narrative, construing through the Mexican influencer Carlos Bello a figure of a young revolutionary. You had Claudio Z. Gonzalez, a wealthy businessman, and he is supporting the organization Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity. So a long central figures against the Mexican opposition. You have Alessandra Rojo de la Vega. She's an opposition mayor, politician, influencer who promoted the march on her platform. And what's more, you have the Atlas Network, a US-based global network of libertarian think tanks that has supported campaigns against all progressive governments in Latin America, including Mexico, Brazil, and many others. And the list is large. You have Javier Neri, Spanish far-right media figure aligned to the far right in Latin America. And you have, do you know who else you have? You have Bolsonaro, expert on boats and digital media, prompting the whole movement. Yes. And you have Eduardo Menoni, a Venezuelan journalist based where? Miami, of course. He's known for his anti-left, anti-communist. He's obsessed with anti-communist campaigns. And you have a huge amount of money putting in. Miguel Angel Alorza, it was estimated that he put in 6 weeks, $5 million into a recent campaign. So what we have here in this body of analysis, the data, the undeniable data, this is not a march of Mexican youth. It's not spontaneous. It's not citizen mobilization. It's a international and national elite coordination protest. And we have a name for that here in South America. It's called coup d'etat. Coup d'etat in slow motion. And it was the exactly same modus operandi in 2013 in Brazil. In Brazil, we had American think tanks supporting Brazilian think tanks to topple Dilma Rousseff through a parliamentary coup, in jailing Lula, and prompting the rise of Bolsonaro. And always those very diffuse demands: insecurity, violence, drug trafficking, corruption, impunity, and justice for Amati. And they have a focus on electoral force. So what we're seeing here is an attempt coup d'etat in American interventionism in the form of a color revolution. Ammar, our question to you.
Before that, though, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
That, Should we look at Claudia Scheinbaum's response?
Yeah, Claudia Sheinbaum came in public and said, Trump called me and asked if we want help with military intervention in Mexico. And as this failed, they start a counter-revolution. Let's hear Claudia Sheinbaum, but this is in Spanish. I don't know if it's in English as well. Yeah, I think you need to.
Estados Unidos
I think you can see the subtitles. I don't know if you can see the subtitles.
Con una intervención se llevó la mitad del territorio. Lo he mencionado muchas veces en las pláticas que he tenido con el presidente Trump, telefónicas. Él ha sugerido en varias ocasiones, o ha dicho,
he has repeatedly offered U.S. military intervention in Mexico, or whatever we need to combat criminal groups. But I've told him every time that we can collaborate, that they can help us with any information they have, that we operate within our own territory. We will not accept intervention from any foreign government. Okay, cool.
You can make it up, more clear textbook. As a military intervention in South America failed, they appealed for think tanks masked as popular revolutions, young people revolting, exactly the same format 2013 in Brazil. Ammar, can you explain to us the color revolution, the elements, the history of it?
Well, I think what you've explained is just incredible. I mean, this amount of money, the kind of coordination, the vile attempts to roll back the democratic gains of the people, and always in the garb of some kind of anti-authoritarianism. This kind of terrible term that I'll come back to in a second. But what color revolutions is a very recent late 20th century phenomenon. But one thing that has to be made clear to anybody interested in understanding the history of modern capitalism is that the political form of capitalism is not liberalism, it's not even conservatism. Fundamentally at its heart is the idea of counter-revolution, rolling back the efforts of those who are willing to expand democratic rights, who are willing to implement the declarations of the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, the revolts of 1848. It can take the form of military dictatorship, it can take the form of liberalism, it can take the form of women's rights, it can take the form of human rights. All of these forms, beneath them is this idea that we must wipe out any threat to the reproduction of the commodity form, the reproduction of capitalism. This is at the core of politics within capitalism. And this we've seen throughout the 19th century. I mean, the optimism of the Communist Manifesto of 1848 stemmed from this big movement, that was erupting across Europe. And what happened to that movement? It was a counter-revolution, a Europe-wide, continental-wide counter-revolution, which kind of triumphed one by one, in which governments who were selling this kind of narrative of patriotism started colliding with foreign elements to oppose their own revolutionary masses. It happened in France. It happened most famously during the Paris Commune, when the Parisian elites sided with the hated Germans to defeat the Paris Commune, their own people who were defending, who wanted to defend French sovereignty. This happened with the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution. Like right after 1917, you had 14 countries invade, help with the invasion of Russia, of the Soviet Union. And they did so in the name of bringing some kind of democracy to Russia, to a country that had the Tsar before Lenin. So it wasn't really about democracy. It was literally about installing the counter-revolutionary white regime, the whites as they were called back then, who were, psychotic people. If we ever get into Russian history, the kinds of people the Americans, the British, the French have supported in the crusade against revolutionaries or in their crusade, anti-communist crusades, it's horrific. Same with how they supported Chiang Kai-shek in the 1930s in China, when he was massacring people left, right, and center. The same with Japan as it was destroying sovereignty. And then this policy continued after the Second World War. Everywhere where there was an attempt to increase the democratic capacity of the people to decide their own path, we saw a counter-revolution. We saw, at times it was through the preferred methods, always military coups, but there's always a combination. The most famous, of course, is Chile, where you have, 1973. Before that, all of these things were done. The regime, the economy was destroyed. Nixon said, make the economy scream, the Chilean economy. So there were these shortages created through a strike by capitalists. It was capital on strike, basically, that created shortages in the economy and paved the way for Pinochet's coup that destroyed the country. In our part of the world, would you imagine when we had a revolution in Afghanistan, and there was very real possibility of left-wing governments in Pakistan, the counter-revolution took the form of supporting jihad, of supporting Sharia. It was the CIA that was saying that the Soviet Union is against the cultural norms of this region. So to protect the cultural norms of this region, the region that had risen against the West, that was now had socialist governments in both Islamabad and Kabul in the 70s. This region, to preserve its traditions, will only be preserved through people like Osama bin Laden, who were CIA agents who were brought into our region as part of the counter-revolution. Later in the 90s, the color revolution, of course, comes from the kinds of revolts that they orchestrated. First, of course, in the Soviet Union. And, there's my friend Pavel has written an excellent piece on how, even the destruction of the Soviet Union was also a coup d'etat. It was a counter-revolution by the end of it. There were genuine concerns that people had, but we now have so much evidence. Back in the day, it was just Michael Parenti writing about how, no, guys, this is actually a CIA operation, in East Germany, in Poland, in the Soviet Union. But now we have so much evidence how much involvement, deep involvement the CIA had in creating this new kind of a geopolitical scene in the East. But then in Yugoslavia, they did the same. In the Balkans, they did the same. There were all these movements that came up in the name of democracy, human rights, funded by NGOs, a bit like what Sara was saying. You were saying about, NGOs being involved, think tanks being involved, a lot of people who were trained in the West. So you have all this like flourishing of fellowships, of like journalists, of like young activists. When I was facing these charges a few years ago, the number of think tanks who would contact me in my email from DC to just come to some fellowship at Harvard or somewhere else, because they thought he's an activist. So activist basically means we kind of prop them up eventually and send them back. The amount of people in the global South who were contacted and bribed and eventually made part of this ambit of Western ideological warfare is incredible. And with social media, it's becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is why it's very, very important for the left to not fall prey to every demonstration on the streets, any kind of human bodies on the street. It should not just like something that should excite us immediately. This is our weak point. This is our weakness. This is kind of the leftist how consciousness or libido, whatever you want to call it. We get excited. There are people out of the streets. The people can be fascist, but it's the people on the streets. But if the people are people who are saying we want to destroy East Germany because it is sending our surplus to help African liberation movements and we don't want to help Africans, then those people are not my people. Same with Chile. If there are people who are supporting who out there supporting coup d'etat, or in Mexico people supporting coup d'etat, or people in the Soviet Union who were on the side of the whites, those are human beings. and at a broad level, every human being should be respected. But these are counter-revolutionaries. So while it's important to stand with insurgencies, left-wing insurgencies of indigenous people, of women, of students, of workers, it is also equally important to stand with the revolutionary states when people have gained power, and when the CIA is manipulating the situation by using leftist tropes of, people's revolt and people coming out and women's rights and democracy, all these words that have been used to impose the worst tragedies on our people. Iraq destroyed in the name of democracy and human rights. Libya destroyed. Afghanistan destroyed. Syria destroyed. This is a machine of destruction at this point, US empire. And it doesn't do it in the name of, some kind of old school colonialism, of civilization or whatever. It does it in the name of human rights, of democracy, of women's rights, of participation, of accountability, of anti-corruption. These are buzzwords that the counter-revolutionary machine has completely weaponized. And too many leftists, they fall for it again and again and again. And we must be very clear that every word is a weapon in the battlefield. And it is being used by all sides. And if we're not careful, if we don't have the discerning power to see how this word is playing out within the balance of forces that exist at a particular conjuncture, then we will start seeing heroes as villains and villains as heroes. And this is the inverted reality that the ideological apparatus of the empire wants to sell to our people.
You touched a point which I think it's absolutely a brilliant synthesis that I wasn't aware of it in such a conscious terms, which is the core of capitalism being the counter-revolution. This is so important to understand that. But I think we have now provocation to you. We have another point in the left. In Brazil, we have the revolutionary left, and you always have social democrats being part of the narrative of the counter-revolution. Maybe it's what you're talking about, right? This comes in Germany. You have the revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, and then you have the SPD, the social democrats, saying revolution is not possible. Revolution, and the same thing we have in Brazil. We have Lula, which is a brilliant mind, a brilliant leader, but is what we would say social democrat, that not necessarily helping revolutionary movements. So tell me the role about the social democracy in Pakistan, in Asia. Do you think there is the same phenomena there?
It is. I mean, by very definition, these are what we've termed vacillating elements. They go back and forth. These are broad coalitions. This is why it is very important for the revolutionary left to never dissolve itself for popularity, right? So if you become the social democrat or being part of a coalition which is broad, is always very important, because politics often happens in coalitions. From our own perspective, which is the left-wing perspective, the February Revolution in 1917 was pretty much a liberal revolution, but totally supported by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and they were part of the coalition initially, and they supported that. But Lenin was very clear that this will eventually lead to a point where everybody will have to choose between moving it further, which would mean deepening the revolution, or moving towards the other direction, which is counter-revolution. And interestingly, that independent position of the Bolsheviks proved to be correct within like 7-8 months. And by September, October, it was clear that those are the only two options. And many Marxists, including most famously the Mensheviks and the anarchists, they eventually were complete counter-revolutionaries, because they were unable to look at that kind of moment as a moment of rupture. Whereas some conservatives eventually joined the Bolsheviks because they thought these are, including some famous generals, because they thought they're defending the sovereignty of Russia against foreign invasion. So things are always open in those moments. So the delicate dialectic is, in February, it was correct to be part of a broad coalition. In October, it was correct to be a hardline leftist and break from the coalition. Political leadership is basically having the foresight to decide what is necessary at that given conjuncture. Is it about maintaining an equilibrium within a broader coalition, a broader umbrella, or is it a moment for escalation? And Lenin was, of course, a master at that. But we also have to learn those techniques based on our own conjunctures. When do we build coalition? Right now, we're building a coalition. We want to be with, Imran Khan's party, other parties that are broadly resisting this regime. But because none of them have a concrete anti-imperialist program, we know there will be ruptures in the future. And we should be prepared for that moment. This is not that moment for rupture. This is a moment to work together with people who are jailed. Tomorrow, a moment of rupture will appear as well, and then everybody will have to choose. But we should be the ones leading, the march of history in those decisive moments.
I recently did an interview with Peter Mertens, the General Secretary of the Workers' Party of Belgium. I'm sure you're familiar with them. And he talked about it in terms of the backbone of the party, the core principles, the backbone of the party, and then the tactics that are absolutely necessary for outreach. And I think that's a very clear, simple, but you'd be surprised at how many political parties don't have that. They don't have any backbone at all, but they only have tactics. And so it's really important to have both. But I think one thing before we move on to Pakistan and Afghanistan and Taliban, which I'm very curious about. And also just aware, Sara, that you're short on time today. So please give me a heads up with that. But just sort of to end this color revolutionary part, I think that the part that is going to confuse a lot of people is that like you said, I really like what you said about the counter-revolution part of basically imperialist psychological warfare in a sense. But for people, how does the average person understand when a historical revolutionary moment is happening versus a color revolution? Because like you said rightly, all these buzzwords get used and we actually care about these things, right? Their co-option. And also I think too, one thing for everyone to realize, because I always get accused of this, is color revolutions do use legitimate gripes, legitimate issues, legitimate concerns. So that's not how you can differentiate them. How does the average person recognize, okay, this is a genuine social movement, genuine revolutionary movement?
My feeling is average people are usually better than many leftist parties, to be honest. Leftist parties get fooled more quickly because these words appear, they're very seductive for us. And we basically have to develop critiques of the ideological apparatus. We should realize that we are imbibing ideology all the time. We live in ideology. Reality is inverted. And if we don't do the hard work of cutting through that reality, through reading, through practice, through ideological debates, through history, through theory, but most importantly, through struggles, the fog of ideology will not go away. And if that argument can be made as part of the public education, public and popular education, both for ourselves and for the people, that this is where this particular movement stands in the balance of forces, the people respond. People always responded to Hugo Chavez when there were all these coup attempts. And he went back to the masses again and again, explaining what these demands are, many of which he said are legitimate demands. But this is why, these are the constraints on me. And this is why these people are manipulating your desires in order to overthrow the only government that can deliver. This is also true for China, by the way. The fact that it's so easy to stir the left against China is part of the ideological weapon that the US has. The US can be supervising, conducting an actual genocide that's televised, and yet you speak to so many leftists, and about China, and they'll be like, what about the Uyghur genocide, which now we have so much evidence is a joke, just to call it a genocide, especially after Gaza. But people, this is a way of always kind of playing on the terrain of the enemy. The enemy is too many times in the contemporary moment. The enemy is setting the terrain for us. The ideological terrain, and we're always being forced to respond by, we condemn this, we condemn Putin's this, we condemn China's action here over here, or we condemn Iran over here. We don't have to do that. And that kind of realization that, look, there are sides in this battle, reality is split, and eventually one can do the postmodern thing of saying, well, they're like infinite fragments, which could also be true at some level. But when you're doing politics, politics always requires a decision. It imposes a decision on you. Either you're with us, or the right is better in that. Bush said that, you're with us or against us. It's at that time you have to be partisan. Lenin had to deal with that. Kronstadt, workers were on strike in Kronstadt. Literally, workers were on strike for better wages. That is like our core issue of the left. And he eventually was forced to fire upon these workers. If we don't see the history of what was happening in the background, then Lenin was worse than the Tsar. Tsar would negotiate with workers demanding wage. But in the larger context, this was a strike done by the counter-revolutionaries. It was the one port that they closed so that the Bolshevik fighters, Red Army, could not get the weapons to fight these maniacs of the whites who were wiping out entire villages, doing like anti-Semitic pogroms as well. And in that moment, you needed the port to be open. So it's a terrible decision to make either way. But this is what the decisions that history impose upon you. Nobody can come out of a real political battle and remain an angel. That desire to be liked by everyone all the time is a debilitating, paralyzing thing that social media promotes in a way. Decisions have a tragic dimension. All authentic decisions have a tragic dimension, and it's okay to live with the consequences of your decisions, especially when history is at stake. So I think that has to be accepted by political partisans.
And just to add to that, using your own reasoning, I think one thing that is striking color revolution is the lack of a concrete demand. It's diffuse. Corruption. It's very diffuse banners. We are against corruption. We are against this. Yeah, as Ileana pointed out, they often co-opt existing true movements, whether we agree with them or not. It's a different issue. But they will not come out of nowhere because it's manipulation, half truth, and most of it lie. Let's say 10% truth, 90% lies. But there is another element, and the banners they aren't that diverse. It's anti-corruption, it's violence, narco-trafficking. It has to do with very individual demands, never social strong demands. But the most important, they would get any flags. Feminism, just like we saw in Afghanistan, let's free women of Afghanistan. They would touch on anything, Black Lives Matter, whatever, but they won't touch the structure of capitalism. They will refuse to touch any structure of equality and capitalism. They will engage on everything, identity movements, which are brilliant for color revolutions, for appeasing the real problems. I think you touch a point. They have the counter-revolutionary in it. We will not touch the capitalist structure. It will remain as it is. Will stay as it is. Yeah.
Well, they will touch upon the capitalist structure, but in such a way that it is completely separate from imperialism. And that's how like perhaps more sophisticated ones, like in the West, sometimes, not that they're color revolutions, like in the US or something. They're not color revolutions, obviously, because it's not, it's US backed. I mean, but yeah, they get co-opted by the same forces that create the color revolutions, right? But yeah, they will sometimes touch upon capitalism, but in such a divorced way from imperialism that you know that it's not a legitimate solution, I think. Or maybe they were just co-opted. They get co-opted very early on, I suppose.
And it's all polite things, Nobody can disagree with the fact if someone says there shouldn't be corruption. We can't say there should be more corruption. If someone says there should be women's rights, it's not like we're going to say, no, it's excellent not to have women's rights.
I mean, they'll say like no billionaires, you know what I mean? So that's where you get the slight critique of capitalism. Yeah, yes. Without
but eventually we have to be like, okay, we will fight these battles without them setting the terrain. And it's not just setting the ideological terrain. Sara just told us the actual infrastructure that they create for this battle to take place, right? So if we are fighting their battles on their terrain with their $5 million and all their think tanks and the entire counter-revolutionary apparatus that they've created, then even if we are able to get in one or two things about capitalism in there, it's still a counter-revolution. It should be rejected.
Yeah. And I think not always, that maybe Ileana will disagree with me, but I think there is a dimension of it that it's our internal colonizers. They might get help from abroad, but they might not. We have our own internal capitalist colonizers go with a banner in Brazil and say we want an agrar reform, which is the most crucial and important element for Brazil, which is a land of continental dimensions where you have people owning land as big as Belgium.
I mean, I think it's important to note that there's counter-revolutionary forces in every country. Even China has counter-revolutionary forces who are Chinese, and they might not be US backed, but they are capitalism, they're capitalists. And the project of China is to make sure they do not gain power, because China is a socialist country. So that is part of the ongoing revolution of China, is to make sure that the capitalist counter-revolutionary forces within their country does not take over.
Yeah.
And then when they take over, they certainly will be working with Western forces, for sure. And even now, they will be working with, but maybe not yet co-opted the way that you're meaning in terms of like a color revolutionary way. But yeah, that is definitely the ongoing process of revolution, I think.